Welcome, everyone. I think I might give another minute or so for people to log in and turn on their audio. If I could ask everyone to mute their mics, that would be great. All right, welcome. My name is Nick Taylor. I'm the director of the Heasley Cox Center for Steinbeck Studies at San Jose State. Our reader tonight is a former Steinbeck Fellow. The Steinbeck Fellows is a program started about 20 years ago by Martha Heasley Cox, a former professor at San Jose State, who wanted to create a fellowship program to support writers working on completing a significant writing project. Over the years, we've had it's almost 75 fellows and given out millions of dollars in stipends to writers. The next application deadline is January 2nd. So if you're interested in applying, please go to steinbeck.submittable.com or to the main Steinbeck Center website, which is sjsu.edu/Steinbeck for more information. The Steinbeck Fellows program is sad to announce tonight that one of the current Steinbeck Fellows, Anthony Viasna-So, who read for us last week, right here, passed away earlier this week. Our deepest sympathy go out to Anthony's family. And I wanted to let everyone know and then express for a minute how much this loss is going to sting the literary community. Anthony was an incredible talent, already under contract for 2 books from Echo. The first one, a book of stories called After Parties, will be out in August, and he was working on a novel when he died. He read a little bit of that last week, and if you want to get to know him and his work, I would encourage you to go to the Steinbeck Center's website and click the link where we've put the archive video of his performance last week. So if we could just have a moment of silence for Anthony. Thank you. So tonight's reader was a Steinbeck Fellow in 2016-17. I believe that's right, Gary. He came to us probably having published more words than any Steinbeck Fellow we've ever had in the history of the program. For most of this millennium, Gary has written the Silicon Alleys column in Metro, the weekly newspaper of Silicon Valley that you can see on in newspaper boxes all over our fair city. I'm pretty sure that if there is a story to be reported about San Jose, that Gary has reported it in one form or another. He's also a San Jose State alum twice over, a lifelong San Jose resident, and the author of a book about the San Jose Earthquakes, our hometown soccer franchise. I've been trying to get him to collect his columns for years, and I'm so glad that he's finally done it and published this book that we are launching tonight, Silicon Alleys, Selected Metro Columns, 2005 to 2020. So keep in mind, though, that in the same way that Bob Dylan just sold his catalog, it's only up to now. And this may end up being just volume 1 of Gary's selected columns. The next 15 years will have to be in the other book right here. I might suggest a blue cover for that one to match. But I am thrilled to welcome my friend and former Steinbeck Fellow, the anti-man about town, Gary Singh. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you very much. It's just kind of like the wayward son who hasn't even left the neighborhood, but is still finally coming back home to roost, and I have a long history with San Jose State. I've lived downtown in the neighborhood for a million years. My mom graduated from San Jose State in the 60s.
You're a legacy.
My grandmother graduated from what was then called the San Jose Teachers College, which is what turned into San Jose State. So I'm actually third generation San Jose State graduate. I've lived in the neighborhood pretty much since I went to school there, which was pretty much the whole decade of the 1990s, and I grew up as a piano player and an audio junkie, and so I went to school at San Jose State to get a music degree, and that's what I did. At first, that's what I did. I spent a lot of time in the art department also, but during those years, I never had any plans to become a writer. It just sort of turned out that way, and I can get into that a little bit later. But so the decade of the 90s was my San Jose State era. And what I can do is, just to open this up, I'm going to read one of the what the book we're releasing this week or this month, essentially, is I've written this column for the weekly newspaper every single week for 15 years. So that's over 800 weeks in a row without missing a single one. And some of them, so what I tried to do with the anthology here is to provide an overview of those 15 years. So there's almost 300 columns in this book. Everything is arranged chronologically. So like chapter 1 is 2005, chapter 2 is 2006, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not a book that is designed for anybody to read front to back. It's sort of like a Ramones greatest hits box set, there's a million songs, each one is 2 minutes long, and you just jump in however you want. There's a killer index, there's a great table of contents, you just jump in and have fun with it, and however you want to consume it. It's sort of like a toolbox of bent perspectives on the entire city of San Jose, and each one of which is connected to the other one, and you get to see the sweeping arc of history, and a lot of this, there's autobiographical stuff that is intertwined in every story, whether it's overtly done or whether it's between the lines or whether it's or all of the above. And so what I'll do, I'm going to start with, it only takes a couple minutes to read each one of these.
Great.
But
give us a taste.
I'll start with this one right here. If you can see that, this is an old Lowry Genie home organ that I used to have at my mom's house when I still lived there. And she just was in the process of getting rid of it finally, about a few years ago. So I'm going to read about that musical instrument, which is the first thing I ever played music on. And so once I find that in the book, and because there's a lot of San Jose State stuff in here. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay.
So what page is it for those of us following along at home?
If you have the book already, it is page 356.
Excellent, thank you.
And I'm going to improvise. I'll probably end up improvising a little bit, but it won't be that much. Okay. And this is about, this old Cheese Master home organ that I grew up playing, bad, easy listening music on. Okay. There comes a time when one needs to downsize. In this case, the first musical instrument on which I ever played a campy version of One Tin Soldier is now headed for the great Cheese Master graveyard in the sky. The Lowry Genie home organ my parents bought for me at Stevens Music in Willow Glen when I was 9 years old, a machine that has long since fallen into permanent disrepair, will now soon be hauled away and put out to pasture. My entire camp humor identity began on that machine, that keyboard. So its demise calls for a twisted eulogy of sorts. But first, some history. Stevens Music, which existed from 1951 to 1984 at 1202 Lincoln Avenue, was an institution in Willow Glen, selling and repairing instruments, plus sheet music and related projects for thousands of people throughout the valley. Entire generations got their chops inside that building, operated by Tom Stevens and his son Gordon. After the main retail business closed, Reich's Music eventually moved into the ground floor, with the upstairs then converting into more lesson rooms and other independent music businesses, including Stevens' violin shop. The entire place was a labyrinth upstairs. Up until Gordon sold the building in 2013, he claimed the oldest continuously operating business license on Lincoln Avenue, going back to 1951. The stories from that building, 1202 Lincoln Avenue, are legendary. In the 60s, members of rock bands like the Chocolate Watch Band and Syndicate of Sound purchased gear at Stevens Music. Patrick Simmons of the Doobie Brothers bought his first guitar there. Synthesizer pioneer Don Buchla showed up and worked on equipment in a back room. And years later, it was the building where I first took music lessons. At age 9, I was already walking in the footsteps of giants. Nowadays, it's Black Sheep Brasserie. And if you walk into that restaurant and observe the upmarket nuclear families nibbling at their duck liver mousse, you can say that's where I first played Love is Blue on a Lowry Genie. The Genie was basically a mini descendant of larger Cheesemaster style home organs that became popular during the Great Depression era as people's dollars went more toward home entertainment. After the Beatles exploded in the 60s, followed by the mainstreaming of synthesizers in the 70s, nobody was buying cheesy home organs anymore. The technology was old hat, so Stevens needed to unload their whole inventory. I subsequently grew up on that Lowry Genie organ, and then a Schaefer and Sons piano, playing sappy pop tunes, easy listening schmaltz and TV themes, or just simply butchering AM radio hits, reading off the sheet music, and not even learning to gig with other people, develop my ear, or play in time with additional musicians. I played everything rubato, as classical musicians would say. Some of these tunes I enjoyed, while others were awful, and I just played them for camp humor purposes. Over time, though, this distinction began to fade. Those polar opposites began to fuse, leaving me with a strange yet integrated taste for awful on purpose humor. If I fumbled through that ridiculous music box dancer abomination, who's to say I couldn't enjoy it for its awfulness? From a Zen perspective, I took humor very seriously, and I took seriousness very humorously. To me, the world was clearly not black and white as Western thinkers wanted to believe. As a result, I can draw a direct line from those moments of easy listening schmaltz at the Lowry Genie right to the current day, each time I write a column glorifying some crumbling old building, or if I perceive beauty in the drabness of suburbia. This is what artists do. We see beauty in the ugliness and vice versa. I've written this before, but it's true. Music kept me away from potentially criminal paths in life. Had I not started playing keyboards, I would never have studied music in college and then come into jobs that led me to travel and become a more worldly person, which in turn led me to start writing in the first place. If not for arts and music education from age 9 until 29, I'd be dead by now. So the old Lowry is about to die a natural death. Like that one tin soldier riding away, my first musical instrument is off to the great perhaps, and I am at peace. Fare thee well, old Genie.
Well done. That's a great selection. It really captures your voice, and it gives us a lot of jumping off points for talking about your life in San Jose. So you were a schmaltz master. You were playing cheesy, easy listening songs on your mom's organ. How does that translate to becoming a music major at San Jose State?
Well, I grew up, like I said, I grew up playing all sorts of home organ music, like easy listening stuff. And, if you've seen those gigantic home organs with like 3 keyboards and a guy working the pedals, cheese master. That's just what everybody, my generation, called it. They were so ridiculous. It was cheesy, and it was just the person playing this is the master of just cheesy music and stuff, so. But I also was a rock and roll piano player. I played rock music also. Okay. I played, everything that, even though I was listening to mostly like punk and thrash metal and all that stuff, I was still a keyboard player. So I still listened to all the stuff that metal and punk people hated, like Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Yes, and all the people that had elaborate keyboardists and stuff. So I was a rock keyboard player and a composer. I wanted to be a composer and study how, and at San Jose State, there was a professor named Alan Strange who was one of the first, or he wrote the first electronic music textbook in the early 70s. And when I say electronic music, I don't mean dance music. I mean, originally what it meant was you're working with modular synthesizers and patching chords and doing all sorts of things with oscillators and soft tooth waveforms and, ring modulation and all sorts of stuff that is now done automatically without you being able to control it and all that. So I went to San Jose State to study with him because he had started a concentration where you could study all this stuff, where you didn't have to be an opera major or a jazz major or a performance major or a history major. You could tear apart synthesizers and write essays about industrial music and all that kind of stuff. And in addition to doing all the stuff that other students had to do also. So I went there to study with him. He was, and we became more like a surrogate father and son kind of relationship. We drank a lot together, got drunk together like father and son, yelled at each other like father and son. It was just kind of, and he set me up with a job where we could travel together and just, he ran an organization that organized conferences every year. So he set me up on a path of international travel to go basically administrate the organization. And so I would get trips to Denmark and Sweden and Japan and China and all that, all while I was in my 20s. And that is sort of what led me into wanting to write down my travels and take notes and be a journalist and observe stuff.
Now, was your early work in writing mainly writing about music?
At first, I wrote papers in undergrad and graduate school just like anybody else, but they let me write about whatever I wanted. They let me write about the Sex Pistols or Throbbing Gristle or punk rock or Dada and surrealism and how all that stuff influenced underground music of the current day. So nobody else in the whole building knew what I was talking about, but I had already began to read all that stuff, so they let me write it. And I was writing some pretty academic stuff for someone who was only 22 years old, but it was all about the Sex Pistols and Throbbing Gristle and underground music and all that stuff. So it was fun. And I can't say where I started. I mean, I can't say the first thing I published. It's hard to really say.
Arlene Biala is on the call, and she says the SJSU music department in the 90s through the early 2000s, as the kids would say, was suspect.
Yeah,
I went wrong, Gary.
Yeah, I went to school with Arlene's brother. So he actually was probably just finishing right when I got there. But there was a lot of people, especially in the jazz programs, which is a little more freewheeling type of situations. Okay,
what does she mean when she says it was suspect?
I don't know. But there were a lot of people that even if they were already graduated, they would still come back and play in the ensembles and things like that. So there were a lot of people that had already were done, but were still circling through and hanging out and just, and we got away with murder. Like we were doing all sorts of crazy stuff. Like, we would use washing machines and amplified shopping carts, and we even dragged the entire car on stage and put microphones all over it. And this is when I was 23.
This was on stage in the music building?
Yeah, I was like 23 years old doing this stuff. Everybody else is like researching how to, what Beethoven did in '03 or something, and I'm sitting there smashing a car on stage with 20 other people, you know. And so it was just now none of that was what was required for us to do. This wasn't for academic credit. It was more just stuff that they let us do because they knew we were going to do it anyway, and they really couldn't stop us.
And you had the blessing of Dr. Strange.
Well, we had the blessing of the staff who worked there, who had the keys to everything. So so that's where the problems and the politics came in, and that's, you know, so there was a lot of you know, we don't have the time to go into all that, but this will, like Arlene said, this will be the next book. Yeah.
So when did you make the transition to writing more generally and trying to publish your work?
That's a great question. I never planned any of this. My time at SJSU was exactly the decade of the 90s. Okay, so as the 90s were ending, the job that I had where we were traveling a lot, that was coming to an end, because it was like Alan was no longer the president, and they were moving, the next president was moving the job to where she was in a different university somewhere across the country. So I didn't have the job anymore. Mm-hmm. I wasn't going to school there anymore. I was done with my degrees. Yet because of that job, though, I still had keys and access to all the buildings and the rooms. And then, you know, the teachers didn't like the fact that, you know, I had access to all the rooms, and I had keys to everything, and I wasn't on faculty or staff or a student. Okay, you know, but traveling is, if I had to pinpoint it, traveling is what started me on the path. I was writing a lot. I really wanted to be a travel writer. And then this is right at the end of the 90s. So the .com boom was exploding. There was a lot of writing work on the internet that not in print publications, actually. So oddly enough, I started online and then went to a newspaper. I went the other way around. Okay, I was doing a lot of work 99, 2000, 2001, just for websites and all sorts of stuff. I mean, educational stuff, travel stuff that I could even get paid for. And then, but at that time, I just didn't have the business sense to really make it as a freelancer. You really have to have your life together, and you have to pitch stories all the time. You have to manage your outreach and keep up connections. And I had a big drinking problem at that time, and I didn't really know how to live, and I didn't know how to manage my own life, let alone have a business sensibility to develop a business as a freelance writer. So, so what I wanted to be was to be all the stuff that Bourdain turned into and that Atlas Obscura turned into, that whole, I explore the underbelly of the world. You know, that's what I wanted to do. I've never, ever wanted to see San Jose ever again for the rest of my life. I wanted to get the hell out of here as soon as I possibly could. But like I said, I didn't have my life together. I didn't have enough guts to really go out into the world and do that. So, and then the Metro, and then the opportunity to start at Metro came right about just after that, around 2001 or so. And then I thought I would be there maybe a year or so. And then it turned into, and then I started writing for them, and they're the ones that they didn't give me my start. I'd already published a whole bunch of stuff at other places, but they gave me a platform to find a local snarky type of voice that just exploded and became totally natural for me to do. You know, it wasn't even work at all. I mean, I realized that I was from here. I had never left San Jose. I had the academic background. I had the punk background. I was a snotty, overgrown teenager, but I had an academic vocabulary. I could write like an academic. I could combine all of this into some bizarre, strange voice that totally worked for an alternative weekly newspaper and would never have been tolerated at a daily paper. Okay, you know, so Metro, I mean, I owe them everything in the next phase of my life, you know, after San Jose State.
Were there specific journalists whose styles maybe or perspectives that you were trying to emulate in any way when you started writing this column?
No, because I didn't think I would be doing it that long. I figured it would last a few months. I'd been fired from every other job in my life. I figured I wasn't going to last there very long. I figured I wasn't, you know. I didn't really have a bright outlook for the future. I just figured I would just do it until they got rid of me or something. I don't know. but as the months grew on, yeah, I would definitely say Herb Caen became one of my heroes, the guy that wrote columns for the Chronicle longer than I've been alive. I mean, even still. And then all the East Coast guys like in New York, like Jimmy Breslin and all those kind of guys, old school newspaper men, the hard drinking, man on the town columnists that would go down to the bar, and everybody would go. All the people who wouldn't talk to anybody else would go talk to Breslin or Herb, those kind of people. This old school, this man on the street, just gritty, really good writers, really good reporters, and just all of them were drunks, but that's just was part of the business back then. Okay,
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting you mentioned Herb Caen, one of the most famous chroniclers of San Francisco. And I wanted to ask you briefly about San Francisco before we get into the nitty-gritty of San Jose. I see you on social media often post pictures of city lights and other places in North Beach, and you say lines like, "San Jose is my actual home, but this is my spiritual home."
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, North Beach, I grew up driving up to North Beach to see in the 80s, to see punk shows and thrash metal shows on Broadway right there, and this was after the punk heyday was over. Okay. I don't mean like 70s or early, I mean like late 80s. Okay. But I was more of a thrash metal teenager driving up there to see shows all the time. I would always go to City Lights, and then the whole history of the Beat Generation people, like Ginsberg and Neil Cassidy and Michael McClure and all the people that were on the periphery of all the tentacles of City Lights and all of that, and then the punk era essentially exploded right down the street, in the late 70s, or parts of that, or one facet of the punk scene. Okay, there were other clubs in San Francisco. I was too young to go to that, but I got there in late 80s. So that whole area of San Francisco seems like my creative heritage is there. Okay, I feel more at home, even though a lot of it's gone now. I still feel a lot of it. If I'm going up there and just slithering through the gutters of Chinatown and Portsmouth Square, and then going into City Lights, and then when I did drink, I would go into Vesuvio or Specs or something, and then or even Tosca, and then Francis Ford Coppola's building is right there, and then Cafe Trieste, all that. I feel more at home there as much as I do anywhere in San Jose. So San Jose is where I'm from, but creatively, my creative heritage is that intersection of Columbus and Broadway, sort of,
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk San Jose, shall we? One of my favorite columns of yours is called "An Infamous Dead Fish Performance at Marsugi's," and you and I both are very much interested in India and Indian literature, and I love that you begin that column quoting William Dalrymple, who's written extensively about India, historical fiction chiefly. And he says, you quote Dalrymple, you say, Dalrymple, he's talking about New Delhi, portrays a city disjointed in time, a city whose different ages lay suspended side by side, as in aspic, a city of jinns.
Yeah.
Jinns, of course, are spirits, tradition in the Arab and Indo tradition. And then you say, this is also my view of downtown San Jose. Explain.
Yeah. See, this is what, like I was saying before, over time, I developed and a perspective that I think has never been really done in San Jose before. Part of the San Jose condition, if you're from here, if you're a native, if you're a native who never left, is you're always thinking about things that have been destroyed, okay, because it's so rarely that anything interesting lasts around here, okay, first of all. Okay, it's not like New York or San Francisco or where there's things that have been around for 80 years and they're always where you can see. San Jose doesn't want that. San Jose prefers.
You're referring to cultural institutions?
Yeah, cultural institutions or buildings, okay,
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, I think since I am half Indian, my dad was from India. Okay. So it's in my blood to just kind of view. I mean, it sounds cheesy to say I'm half Eastern and half Western, or to say Dalrymple is using a Eastern perspective. Okay, but just to simplify it, so I don't have to explain it for 1,000 words. I mean, it's more like in San Jose, there are always things being destroyed right next to things that are being created. And if you've been around for 30 years, you can't help but just see how the passage of linear time is merging with like culture and merging with physical landscape and buildings and things like that at all. And you can easily see or you can imagine, that's important. I'm not saying there's physically ghosts in the building, but you can imagine what used to be there, especially if you did stuff there 30 years ago. Like I can't walk down First Street and not think about, well, when Nirvana played in that same building a couple times. I wasn't there, but I know that they played there a couple times. Or when Johnny Thunders or all these other dead people that are played in the building across the street, or, so there's always, if you've been around San Jose a long time and you're alone most of the time, you think a lot, okay, so, and it's just, I just automatically look at things from a combined, Western linear time mixed up with, temporal merging with the physical landscape, if that makes any sense. I'm kind of mixing it up here a little bit, but that's what I'm talking about in that. And that story is kind of I'm being sarcastic on purpose because, I mean, I go on to explain about a wild performance art piece that I did in that same building. Okay. But I've used Dalrymple's that concept in a few other columns, because I think that it really does help you to understand, or at least contemplate the San Jose condition a lot more, rather than saying, okay, well, that's the building where Nirvana played, or like this building over here, why did they have to destroy that place? Or it just feels like this is how a travel writer would write the story. They would talk about the history. They would talk about, how time is different. And I mean, I've been on that street for 30 years. It's really hard to explain that to somebody else.
Interesting. Do you consider yourself a travel writer who writes about home?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that. Yeah. I mean, I don't care if people consider what I'm doing to be travel writing or not, but that's part of why I stayed there for so long. I figured if I can't go around, if I can't leave and travel the world and write travel, I can do that in my own hometown. That's part of why I started to write all these stories about walking through. And San Jose, there's not that much to look at. Okay. So I mean, there's no like hanging gardens of Babylon or whatever. I mean, there's no commercial monuments or anything. But what's way more interesting in San Jose anyway is the back alleys and the streets and the industrial wastelands and the crumbling transmission shops and the repo men that work down the street, or whatever. I mean, so all of that's way more interesting to me. So that's what a travel writer would write about anyway. If they came here, they wouldn't write about San Pedro Square Market. I mean, who the hell cares? Okay, so they would come. I mean, they'd walk down First Street and look at all the abandoned car lots, or they'd walk down San Carlos Street and look at all the antique shops and what used to be there and talk about the history. In India, there's a few extra 1,000 years to talk about. Okay, San Jose, there isn't. Okay, but I'm writing those stories as a travel writer would write those stories.
So it occurs to me that looking over the breadth of your work, that your subject in this column is San Jose, Silicon Valley more broadly, but your work falls into a bunch of different themes, different. I prefer to think about them as like facets of the city. There's music, there's film, art, literature, history, tech, religion. Are there any other facets that you feel you haven't been able to explore that you want to, or perhaps you've been prohibited from exploring?
Well, that's a good question. I've never been asked that before. Well, I think this is part of the reason why I arranged all the columns chronologically, is because there's no way to organize it into categories, or facets. Okay. There really just isn't any way to do that. I mean, I could be writing a story about that could be, there could be Zen Buddhism and urban blight and punk rock, like all in the same paragraph. Okay. That could be all which could be, that could be the category, each one of which could be categories, so they're all connected to every other facet, so that's how I see it. It's more, I would say there's no way to separate out one particular facet of San Jose.
No, I guess what I'm asking is there something you always wanted to know about San Jose that you just, like a nut you've never been able to crack about the city?
That's a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that. I would, there's a lot more of the history that I haven't had the time to really research and look into yet. Like there's so much, there was so much, Latin music and Mexican music going on the East Side in the 60s, for example. Everybody talks about, okay, well, what did the Jefferson Airplane do, or what did Chocolate Watch Band do, or where all that, the rock and roll history. But there was also a huge amount, and Luis Valdez talks about this a lot. There was a huge Latin scene of music out in the East Side that is at least as much important, but nobody ever writes about that. That would be one example, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm just off the cuff. I'm sure there's more that I could think of later.
Yeah, sure. So I have a question from an audience member. He wants me to ask about the early days of Cadre and the 01 Festival and all those performance art experiments organized by Joel Slayton.
Yeah, that's a great question. I talked earlier about Alan Strange, who was my mentor in the music department. Joel Slayton was my mentor in the art department. Okay. And it wasn't like a separate department. Okay. I mean, they were separate departments, but I kind of bounced back and forth a lot, and then Alan and
well, you
Joel,
did an interdisciplinary master's, right?
Yeah. And Joel was my thesis, one of my thesis advisors for that era. One thing that is unique about this book is that the stories in the book are just my column, the Silicon Alley's column. Okay, so all the other stuff I wrote and all the other sections of the paper, like if it was in the art section or the music section, or if it was a cover story, like that stuff is not in the book. The book is just my column. Okay, so most of the 01 stuff was in other parts of the paper. So there is a few stories in the book there. But Joel was doing.
So tell us, what is 01 for those of us?
Well, 01 was a multidisciplinary art and technology and science biennial. Art. I mean, I hate to use the word festival because it's more like a biennial that you would see in more international types of urban places. Like Sao Paulo or Vancouver or whatever. But and Joel helped organize it. Joel was in charge of the Cadre Institute in the art department, which was kind of like in the 90s when I was hanging out there. It was a totally radical place. People were doing all sorts of stuff. Brett was basically hacking into the Mexican government's website in support of the Chiapas. When the whole Subcomandante Marcos, operation was going on. This is right when the internet was starting, like around 95, 96. Okay, so there was the word cyber attack wasn't invented yet. Okay, but they were doing stuff like that, but as an art project to show what the web could be used for. Okay, and this is when there was all sorts of politics all over campus about who was going to be which department was going to be the first ones to get on the internet. Okay, and the politics were just ugly. You can imagine. Okay, the whole campus was using these really horrible modems, basically ADI boxes. And if Alan's still in the audience, he'll remember what I'm talking about. These big, ugly, like phone book looking things, mini, modem things. And it was just, everybody was fighting to see who could get on the internet first, whose budget would pay for what, and in the art department, Joel and those guys were basically doing it illegally. They were just basically circumventing the whole campus computer network and doing it themselves. Okay, because they just didn't want to wait for the computer center and all the bureaucracy to get it set up, So there was a lot of radical stuff going on, and 01 started out as, like a giant international arts, festival, but, a biennial meeting every 2 years it happens. And, and they do this in high cultural cities all over the world. Every major city in Europe has like some kind of sculpture biennial or, painting biennial or whatever. And he started that. he and Joel, along with a million other collaborators, started those festivals here. And I wrote a cover story every time that they did one, at least the first 2 or 3, because nobody else in the media here understood what it was. I was the only one, because I had come from Joel's department, in the 90s.
And that festival's not going on anymore, right?
No, there's a few events in the book that talk about some of the ideas and the projects they were doing, but later, around like 2012 or so, like the headquarters for it was over on South First Street, which in the building that's now Uproar Brewery. But that they just couldn't make it work. There wasn't.
Yeah.
It was too outre and highbrow, or not highbrow, but too international and outre for suburban San Jose to really understand it. And that's my opinion. Okay, I don't represent anybody else. Okay, and it was just the type of thing where you need to be living in a place where the majority of the people would just appreciate culture to begin with. Okay, and San Jose isn't always like that. Unfortunately.
Yeah, one of the things that you hear again and again from people involved in the arts in San Jose is how difficult it is to sustain arts institutions for very long here. I'm thinking of the San Jose Rep, the San Jose Opera. These are institutions that were once very well established and sometimes disappear. And I wondered if you have any insight into why that is so in a community with so much wealth and so many things that are permanent or semi-permanent. We struggle so much to maintain art institutions.
Well, each institution goes by the wayside for a different reason. It's not the same exact scenario. Mm-hmm. Some of it could be financial mismanagement or whatever. But the first thing that has to be done is because the answer is to put arts and music education back into schools from kindergarten permanently. Okay, that's the first thing. Yeah. If you do that, that will solve everything in 20 years. Okay, but the people in charge, the people in City Hall, none of them are artists or musicians, so they don't understand this. Arlene is, of course, okay, and see, I grew up playing musical instruments. Okay, if you grow up playing a musical instrument, you will automatically have a much wider taste in music. You won't grow into one of these people that listens to only metal or only hip hop or only this. Okay, you will have a much wider variety of musical taste, a much wider perspective.
You were playing Barry Manilow on the organ, right?
Right. You can play Barry Manilow on the piano while listening to Black Flag. The next. Okay, and I mean, all of this is obvious to anybody who's grown up as a musician. Okay, but if you put art and music, if you require it in school from the very beginning, then kids will learn how to collaborate better. They'll learn teamwork. They'll learn that, there's better things to do besides just sit alone in your room and playing air guitar to your Kiss records, or whatever. Okay. I mean, everybody who's a musician knows this already. Okay. So if your kids grow up with an understanding of arts and culture and what it means, then you'll have the next generation of San Joseans that values culture and they'll want to go do cultural stuff. I mean, it's not that complicated, but the people in City Hall are kind of have there could be 5 million people here and it would still be a suburb, that's unfortunately.
So,
this is my opinion, okay? Not everyone's going to agree.
I know. I asked for your opinion. You were saying you might read a piece about all the different houses where you lived. Would you like to read another one?
Yeah, this is related to San Jose because there's some stuff in here about San Jose State also. Let me just find where the damn story is. Okay, here. Okay, if you have the book, this is on page 361. Okay, and again, I have nothing but gratitude. Okay, there's no other newspaper in the world that would let me get away with this. Okay, so let me just. Okay, this is called animal houses. It's about all the party houses that I lived in the 90s when I was at San Jose State. Okay, and there's some there's some college stuff in here too. There's going to be a few things that'll repeat what we already said, but anyway, here we go. In the fall of 1990, I moved into a house at 361 North 10th Street in downtown San Jose, and the rest of that decade went either downhill, uphill, or sideways, depending on one's perspective. In various downtown houses, I would spend the next 10 years living a dual life, half academic, half rock and roll dude, with the schizo never the twain shall meet identity fueling my creativity. After leaving 10th Street, I lived near the Sofa District, then moved into North 6th Street, North 7th Street, South 5th Street, South 9th Street, and then finally a friend's living room on 2nd Street as Y2K emerged. Beethoven lived a similar life in Vienna, moving from place to place. Same thing with Kafka in Prague. So they've got my back. Together, all of the dwellings served as fodder for novels I started and failed to finish. So now I'll reflect on some of the highlights I think influenced columns of the current era. At 361 North 10th, for example, each of the 5 roommates paid about $200 a month to live in that house, 1990. We converted a detached garage into a venue where bands played at our parties. One band, the Nowhere Men, featured a pre-Rancid Lars Fredriksson along with a singer that now sells ads at Metro 30 years later. Later in April of 1991, I moved into a house a few blocks away from the newly christened Sofa District. My roommates had just been issued an eviction notice right before I moved in, although they didn't tell me at first. This was back when Cactus Club, Marsugis, Ajax, and FX all hosted bands that would later vault to worldwide stardom. Other groups, usually the ones with no shot at stardom, would use our house for the after-show parties. The wreckage throughout that subsequent summer rivaled any classic punk rock party house anywhere. A friend next door met her future husband somewhere in the middle of the whole mess, and they are still married to this day. After the sheriff forced us out of that house, I moved in with 2 female roommates at 144 North 6th Street. For two years, they were the sisters I never had. Even if we bickered like siblings, I either had their backs and protected them at shows when we were all wasted together, or I walked them home. Sometimes they had to walk me home. All of this unfolded as I lived a separate life at San Jose State in the music department, writing C code to make excruciating noise collages on SGI machines, or smashing amplified shopping carts on stage, or studying 20th century avant-garde composers like Edgar Varese, Stockhausen, and John Cage, a life unknown to my friends in the rock clubs. By day, I sped up drum machines to sound like machine guns, or wrote satanic lyrics for assignments in 16th century counterpoint class. And by night, I got wasted while Urge Overkill played for 10 of us at Marsugis. Then everything came to a glorious peak during 3 years at 414 South 7th Street, right near the corner of San Salvador, right near campus. Not to blow my own kazoo, but people still talk about that house. And if you've read Incredibly Strange Music from research publications, well, that book should have included our house, because zillions of old tacky thrift store LPs graced the walls, and we drunkenly blasted the worst easy listening music we could find. This was a block from the SJSU Event Center, and we charged concert goers $5 to park in our front yard so they could avoid the parking garage. As a result, they'd buy us beer in exchange. It was creative urban placemaking long before anyone at City Hall used that term. After getting my bachelor's degree, I even walked from that house at 7th and San Salvador all the way to Spartan Stadium for graduation. After losing various campus jobs and girlfriends and being the last dude left at that house, I then lived on 5th Street, 9th Street, and then 2nd Street, but emerged with a master's degree in a traveling life that connected me to music professors, programmers, and audio experimenters the world over. Not a moment was wasted, even if I usually was. Everything was preparatory material for the current moment and the current column that you're now listening to. Happy New Year. So this is
well done.
So this is another example of I have to come up with something every week, so, so it's much more fun to fill the space with a story like that, once in a while, where I can just say, okay, I'm basically writing to myself. I'm saying, okay, look, I didn't waste all those years. I can now write about it, and I can tell you I'm writing about it, and I can tell you that I didn't waste those years because I just wrote a column telling you that.
Yeah.
It's
All
like
right,
it's like a situationist art project in newspaper column format or something.
I'm going to take some questions from the audience now from the
Please.
chat. Kelly Harrison says, I used to hang out at the Phoenix Bookstore Cafe that had the jazz club in the back. Late nights were at Quad Tay, now Flames, and a parking garage. What do you miss the most? And don't say Frontier Village. Ha ha.
Well, those restaurants those were great places too. I mean, I miss the tea shop that used to be near San Pedro Square Market, which is gone now. I miss, there's all sorts of little places like that I miss. And I think what comes across, if you're a native, what comes across in the book, and this was totally unintentional, is that probably half the stuff in here doesn't exist anymore. The buildings I'm writing about, or the restaurants and the places and the hangouts that I'm writing about, are gone now. And I didn't intend that to be that a theme or anything, but that emerged as I was putting it all together, so it just made me, it makes you emphasize even more, that the part of the San Jose condition is just loss and abandonment and, displacement right in the same neighborhood where you're supposed to be at home, and then everything is gone. And, every place that you want to go hang out at, it doesn't exist anymore, and, I'm not having a crisis over this or anything, but, there's no way not to think about these things if you lived here for a long time. Mm-hmm. So I miss a lot of stuff, but I don't want to be the person that sits around and says, oh, well, it was so much better back in those days. I don't want to turn into that person, so I have to find ways to create or to imagine perspectives that, can at least be creative about how you contemplate the whole thing. And that's why I'm doing the column, because it's just a way to be creative and say, hey, well, this is the place we live in, it doesn't exist anymore, but I still live here, so how do I think about that every week? Yeah. To me, that's the San Jose condition.
Viet Thanh Nguyen would agree with you. He's written about his parents' market, which was, in the space across from City Hall. Do you remember that place? Yeah,
that story is in here. Now, again, I write a newspaper column. I don't write, it's not journalism, okay? So my job is just to provide snarky commentary on things. So that's what I did. So I didn't write about his situation as a news reporter would write about it, okay? Because this is his story. He should be the one that tells that, okay? It's not my place to tell his story in that way. And then there's some serious trauma involved with that story. It's really personal for him, okay? But I was, I believe, the first person that brought that above ground for at least the local audience to put that in. Maybe he said it first. Maybe he talked about it first somewhere else. I don't know. But I was the first person, at least in the San Jose publication, to mention that story. But it's a great story because it's a perfect example of everything we've been just talking about. Okay. Like that market was right there across from where City Hall is now. It was right next to a great dive bar called Lenny's Cocktails. Charlie's Liquors was across the street. The Winchells, where the cops shot each other tragically, was right there. That whole corner has a dark history for so many different people, and this is what I was talking about earlier with, the jinns, from Dalrymple, and the ghosts and the spirits and the ways that the temporal or the physical landscape merges with the linear passage of time, and then there's hauntings and all sorts of stuff. And his story, it just was mind-blowing, because I remember that store and I read The Sympathizer like 30 years later, not even realizing this is the same person or the offspring of the people that ran that store, and it's just crazy, Yeah. So that's a great story. Every San Jose native should be required to read, or not my story, but to read what he's written about that. He was just on CBS this morning a couple of weeks ago talking about it.
So Alex wants to know, what are you reading? What are your current reads?
That's a great.
Tis the season to buy books for everyone we know. So
Yeah. I just read. I read a lot of Asian American diasporic authors just because I want to know what they're writing about and what they're doing. You know, I read Interior Chinatown, which just won.
Who?
Charles, he just won the National Book Award. That's a great, hysterical book. It's all about all the ways that Asian Americans.
And it's written in screenplay form, right?
It's written in screenplay format, and it's like, okay, well, today you're going to be the kung fu guy. Okay, it's a parody or a satire of how Asian Americans are stereotyped in Hollywood roles. And it's a hysterical book. I'd recommend Interior Chinatown. And then I just read the book called Red Pill by Harvey Kunzru, which is about it just came out in hardback, so it's pretty brand new. But it's about, and he's my age. He's also, I think, half Indian and half white. You know, and he wrote about it's about this middle-aged professor on sabbatical, and we're going to like an academic think tank center in Berlin, you know, and he's having a midlife crisis, and there's a lot of stuff that from the mid-90s. He wrote for Wired magazine back in the mid-90s when I was doing all the stuff that I've been talking about here. So he has the same kind of half academic, half like, you know, snotty punk type of voice, you know. So it's a really great book. The Red Pill is what it's called. And he goes to Berlin and then discovers this whole underground right-wing fascist plot to take over the sitcoms and all. It's a great book. It's really, really good, you know. So good.
We have some people on the chat who've read it and loved it.
Yeah. What else? Roberto Lovato, who is in San Francisco, wrote an incredible memoir called Unforgetting about it. His roots are in El Salvador, so he's writing about he's basically holding up a two-way mirror. You know, it's basically his history with his intergenerational trauma mirrored against the whole history of El Salvador's war and violence, and it's just an incredible book, really good. So there's a lot, you know. So that's a few.
Thank you. That'll get us started.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions that people would like to ask Gary? You can either unmute yourself or type your question in the chat. And
again, this is 400 pages anthology of newspaper columns for the last 15 years. And what I've been saying again is, you know, it's like a Ramones greatest hits box set. You don't have to, there's a million songs. They're each 3 minutes long. You don't have to read it from beginning to end. You jump in, look in the index, see if your friends are in there, you know, look in the table of contents. Arlene's asking, have I ever missed a deadline? Not on the weekly column, I haven't, but other times, yeah, I have, but not recently. It had to do more where I was still, there were back in the days when I was still drinking. Yeah, I would be really pissed off and treating people like shit. And I would just say, look, I'm not going to do this fucking story, you know, fuck you guys, you know. And it was I was the one with the problem, you know. So that happened a couple of times, and I missed a deadline because of that. But no, I generally don't miss deadlines. I'm one of the good guys in that sense. But, you know.
I mean, I can't, as a writer myself, I can't even say how impressed I am that you've filed 800 consecutive weekly columns. I mean, I know a lot of writers who think of writing as a discipline. You know, our friend Peter Nathaniel Malai is one of them.
Yeah.
You know, lots of writers are that way. And you're an inspiration to all of us for what you've done. And I wanted to thank you for coming and sharing this book with us at San Jose State. One of the things I miss most about not being on campus every day is not seeing you all around all the time.
Well, you're way too kind.
Well, it's true. You know, those of you who walk in downtown San Jose have seen Gary, I'm sure. And I think that by next fall, I think we'll all be back to that.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It's still my neighborhood. I never left, you know. So, well, I haven't left yet. There will be a day that I don't do this anymore, but I can't end up being 75 years old and still doing this. And I'm just afraid I'm going to turn into one of these people that sits around in Facebook groups and argues about where the Dairy Queen was in 1962 or something, you know. There's all these people in San Jose like that, you know, but you know.
Oh,
But,
those people exist everywhere. It's not just
yeah,
San Jose.
this is true. Okay, but
Yeah.
I don't have enough of a future plan to say what I'm going to be doing, so that I don't know. But I would like this to inspire other local people to see their own city in different ways. That's the idea. That's the real point, you know.
Yeah.
Because somebody else has to do this besides me. I can't be the only person that just has all these oddball ideas about stuff, you know. So if it can
I'm looking
inspire
forward to using this in classrooms, because I think that this will be incredibly inspirational to our students, many of whom are from this area.
Well, great.
Maybe don't have the chops yet to do what you're doing in this book, but certainly have the inclination and the vision to
there will be an ebook too. We just haven't done it yet, so it'll happen. And
great.
And you know, and again, I think it would be a great classroom type of thing, because everybody that comes into the newspaper world these days, a lot of them just can't. They come out of journalism school, but they know how to report, but they're not creative writers, you know. And for an alternative weekly paper, for those people that still know what that is, okay, you know, it's always better to come from a creative writing background than a reporting background, at least for Metro's sake, you know, because, you know, they want the weird people, they want the indigents and the wayward people that have the fucked up ideas about everything. That's what they want, you know. Whereas a daily paper, they don't let you can't do that stuff. It's you're not allowed to be that way, you know. So I have Metro to thank for so much.
Well, thanks so much for coming tonight, Gary, and thanks to everyone who came out to the reading. This has been a co-production of the Center for Literary Arts and the Martha Heasley Cox Center for Steinbeck Studies. Thank you, Selena, director of the CLA, and Alex, her assistant. Thank you for coming out. And happy holidays, everyone. Good luck with finals. Bye-bye.
Awesome. That was great. Bye. Bye, everybody.